To some, it seemed like another classic confrontation of the big guy and the little guy. The little guy was represented by the sourdough miner, prospector, with his sluice box, his pick, and his gold pen. The big guy was represented by complex mining concerns, complete with outside financing, big buildings, electrical plants, and complex machinery, and the never-ending dull roar of the stamp mills. This classic confrontation between the independent sourdough miner and big business was an important element in the founding, settling, and developing of one of the most picturesque and beautiful cities in all the world, Juneau, Alaska. The confrontation between big business and the independent sourdough had an interesting beginning. Fred Culver and two companions were prospecting along the mainland shore in southeastern Alaska.
Here were three of us out prospecting. We followed a creek for some ways and found a kind of small mountain valley. There's another creek, so we followed along it a ways. Then we found a small stream that flowed into a nice big bay or lake. We weren't sure which. It was on this last small creek that we found gold, lots of gold. We built a rocker, and the three of us mined for nigh on to 2 weeks. Then the Indians came and started a fight. I tell you, it was really fierce. My buddies were killed, but I managed to scoop up some of that gold and got away in our small boat. I was lucky. But when the Hudson Bay steamer Otter picked me up, I was about done for. The gold I had assayed out at about $1,500. Well, folks were really excited. They organized a party next spring to take me back to the lost rocker mine. At least, that's what they called it. I wasn't feeling too good, and I got all confused. They were shouting at me and threatening to lynch me, and that sure didn't help, no sir. Finally, I just collapsed in a heap, and they sent me to Sitka to the hospital.
Poor old Culver never did recover. He died there in Sitka. Some say he simply led those fellows up the wrong creek on purpose. And when he was very ill in Sitka, he told his friend Mike Powers about the mine's location. And then during the next 30 to 40 years, hundreds, including Mike Powers, looked for the mine. Was the lost rocker ever found? Well, some say it was, there, on the Gastineau Channel, where Juneau stands today. Mount Juneau, towering above the whole scene, had looked down on many visitors. Not all came to stay. George Vancouver was one of the first white men to visit. He sailed in 1793 and 94. Vancouver, a former officer under Captain James Cook, came to chart and explore the area. He named the Lynn Canal after his birthplace in England and Douglas after the Bishop of Salisbury. James Douglas, the first governor of the area, explored along the Taku River and built Fort Durham at Taku Harbor. The first white settlement on the Alaska mainland was to last only about 3 years. Business was not good. The Taku Indians preferred fighting to trading, and this served to drive the other tribes away. Fur trading in the general area prospered, however. The Indians traded their furs for boots and blankets and other items they needed. A survey was taken for a telegraph line to Siberia in 1868. It was during this survey that the narrow, icy channel described by Vancouver received the name Gastineau after one of the Hudson Bay steamers. When Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867, the British were given 2 years to settle their affairs and leave the mainland. This was to leave a void in the area that would not be filled until gold was discovered. Passing under Mount Juneau was the famed naturalist John Muir, who arrived in 1879. On his way, traveling to the head of the Lynn Canal, Muir visited 2 Auk villages and also Auk Glacier, now known as Mendenhall. He didn't go into too much detail, but he did note the mineralized character of the shoreline. These same observations were made by one John Pilz, a German mining engineer, who at this time was busy building a stamp mill near Sitka.
We were looking for some more people to work in the mill at Sitka. I knew of the mining near Wrangell in the Cassiar region, so I arranged for the steamer California to bring me a half-dozen men. 2 of those men were Joe Juneau and Richard Harris. Juneau was a French-Canadian and a good hard rock prospector. He had trouble reading and writing. Now, Harris was just the opposite, a college graduate. Well, it was a good thing. He needed it to describe some claims and record their location. That claim staking came about because of my arrangement with the Indians. They refused to let any other tribe work for me in the Sitka mines, but they described the shiny metal to them so they could locate it in other areas. Now, that's because of our standing offer, 100 Hudson Bay blankets and work for the tribe at $1 per day for any ore samples that proved the value. Because of this, old Chief Cowie of the Auk Indians brought samples of the gold ore in his area to me. We grub-staked Juneau and Harris and instructed them to go with Cowie to find the source of the ore. I found later that my 2 prospectors traded most of their rations for the Indians' home brew called Juneau and spent most of their time drinking on the beach. It's a good thing Chief Cowie had visions of all those blankets before him because he didn't give up. He brought still more ore and told me about my 2 prospectors and their celebrations. As you can imagine, I was furious. But there was no one else available, so I sent Juneau and Harris again with Cowie to find gold. I understood that he practically led them by the hand up Snowslide Gulch, down Quartz Gulch, and into the Silver Bow Basin. I found out later that they did find gold. After digging out about 1,000 pounds of ore, they headed back to Sitka. After a fashion, I was convinced they were heading for Canada with the ore. They were stopped on their southerly voyage by one of the prospectors I had grub-staked. He brought those 2 back at gunpoint. After that, I took no more chances. The next time my 2 prospectors, Harris and Juneau, went to Silver Bow Basin, I went along. We knew we had really struck it rich this time.
All this was happening on the mainland. And just across the channel on Douglas Island, a group of 5 men known as the Ready Bullion Group were working at the mouth of Ready Bullion Creek. A reported $15,000 was taken out of this area by 1882. A mile or so north, a miner known as French Pete staked his claim. He called it the Paris. And then John Treadwell came on the scene.
Word of the discoveries in the area reached the ears of some San Francisco investors. They hired John Treadwell to travel to the area to investigate. He met French Pete, who had staked the Paris. And through negotiations with him, he received rights to the claim in September of 1881. At first, he wasn't really impressed with the acquisition. The quartz on the surface was decomposed, really didn't show much promise. Treadwell's attitude changed, however, after he collected some samples and took them to San Francisco for testing. The test results sent him hurrying back for more samples. The following spring, he returned from San Francisco to help organize the Alaska Mill and Mining Company, bringing north the machinery and equipment for a 5-stamp mill.
Hard rock mining replaced placer mining, and machines replaced the individual prospector with his pick, shovel, rocker, or sluice box. Placer mining requires the prospector his pick, shovel, sluice box, and rocker, and hours of backbreaking labor. Hard rock mining required much more financing. It also required organized labor. Many people are familiar with the placer method of obtaining gold. Through a washing process, the lighter material is gradually sifted to the top. and finally removed by sluicing and washing. Finally, after a series of sluices and washes, the gold and black sand is left at the bottom, and then finally, just the gold. Gold trapped in rock is quite another matter. In the big Juneau and Douglas mines, huge tunnels were dug into solid rock, stretching to great lengths and depths. Workmen traveled deep into the tunnels to blast and drill the rock loose. It was then removed in ore cars on tracks. Some were pulled by mules. Later on, more sophisticated methods were used. Ore cars were dumped by large rotating machines. The ore was then graded, crushed further, and run along conveyor belts. Waste material was removed, and the rock was ready for the final crushing in the stamp. The rock was introduced in the chamber, and the stamp heads continuously rose and fell, crushing the rock to fine powder. After the gold ore was reduced to powder in the stamp mills, water was added, and the mixture combined with mercury, sometimes called quicksilver. Large copper plates were coated with mercury until they had a bright silver appearance. The gold ore mixture, or amalgam, was poured over the mercury-coated copper plate, and the waste materials and water ran off. Small lumps of amalgam were formed on the plate in the process and were scraped off into a crucible. The crucible was placed in a retort and heated to a high temperature. This vaporized the mercury, which passed through the condenser and into a container for reuse. The crucible now contained a sponge-like substance that was almost pure gold. The transition from simple placer mining to complex hard rock machinery mining was the subject of much contemplation among old-timers who were saddened by the passing of the individual, his sluice box and his gold pan.
We worked on constructing miles of ditches and flumes there in Silver Bow Basin to carry water to huge sluice boxes. And them fancy hydraulic nozzles of water giants began to replace the pick and shovels and chewed up the plastered ground. Finally, 10 years after the discovery, they finished a brand new wagon road from town to the basin. Lots of us could see the handwriting on the wall. Little guy didn't have much choice. He worked in the big mine, so he didn't work. One big mine I remember was the Alaska Perseverance. One of the best-paying mining properties in the basin was the Ebner Mining Company. Not too far away, the Sheep Creek Mining District had such names as Silver Queen, Glacier, and Reagan, and the Andersons. Oh, there was a lot of activity on the mainland, all right, but what happened over on Douglas Island would outstrip Juneau for a time. Both Douglas and Treadwell soon had more folks in Juneau.
The Treadwell complex evolved from French Pete's Paris and grew to contain the Mexican, the Ready Bullion, and others. At first, the Treadwell was worked by the open pit method, and a huge glory hole resulted. And it was so called because so many people went to their glory working there. When the ore deposit dipped, the operation went with it and moved underground. And when it was abandoned, the glory hole was huge. The Empire State Building would have fit into it. The vein ran roughly northwest to southeast on an angle to the Gatineau Channel. And because of this, almost all of the Ready Bullion mine was under the bed of the sea. An inclined shaft bore down into the depths for about 1,600 feet. The ore was not of the highest grade, but it was abundant. And so was water power to run the operation. A vast ditch stretched 20 miles into the interior to deliver water to the site. Over the 34 years of operation from 1882 until 1916, $60 million in gold was rendered by the Treadwell stamps. The free gold collected in the mills was cleaned up regularly each month, retorted and melted into gold ingots that weighed about 80 pounds and averaged $18,000 apiece. The company employed hundreds in tunnels below the ground, and hundreds more in a sprawling complex above ground. In addition to the mills, there was a foundry, machine shop, a general mercantile store, repair shops, storage sheds, and warehouses. There was a large house for the superintendent and smaller homes for company officials. And there were bunkhouses for the unmarried men and mess halls, one which could feed 300 at a setting, and, for that time, very modern kitchens. Married miners and mill workers had cottages, and there were school buildings and a post office. A large recreational building had reading rooms, a gymnasium, a bowling alley, and even a heated swimming pool. 95% of the men at Treadwell were single. Well, the company preferred it that way, partly because if a single man died, the company's only obligation was providing a $150 funeral expense. The independent sourdough scorned the Treadwell and other large mining operations. And even though they were hungry and wages were low, those old independent sourdoughs tried their best to preserve their independence. And then there came the time when John Treadwell decided that he would use Chinese labor in the Treadwell operation.
Many of the Chinese had come to the north from California and British Columbia to work in the mines. To them, it seemed like good money. The mines had been using Indian help, but they were available only during certain months. Treadwell knew that the Chinese would work for less, so he hired them. It was bad timing. The earlier big money days were over, and activity had slowed down in the placer mines. Over 100 prospectors had left the area in 1884 and 5. Even though many refused to work in the big mines, they resented the Chinese working. Then people began pitching dynamite at the Chinese Juneau homes and complaining about the coolies having work when they had none. People became very angry. On January 23rd, 1886, a big dynamite explosion went off right at the center of Juneau. It was lucky it didn't kill anyone. They did post a $1,400 reward for the guilty parties. The day after that dynamiting, signs were posted around stating that all of the Chinese would be killed unless they left. A few days later, Treadwell granted them asylum on Douglas Island and took them over by boat. All was quiet until August 4th. That day, 50 angry men crossed to the island, demanded that Treadwell send all Chinese south. Treadwell pointed out that he needed labor, offered any one of the mob an immediate job. The men left, but said they'd be back, and back they came. On August 6th, 100 men, most of them with guns, poured onto Douglas Island and herded 86 Chinese to the beach. Treadwell thought the government would punish the mob, so he told everyone to go along while he sent the company tug to Sitka for help. The mob chartered one boat and commandeered another. They herded the Chinese aboard and shipped them out at dawn. Treadwell saw to it that they had enough rice to eat, but the crowded conditions on ship wouldn't allow any of them to lie down. When they took them off in Wrangell, it was a very shaken and seasick group.
Only one Chinese remained. He was called China Joe. He had grub-staked many a prospector. Everyone knew Joe and liked him. Juneau's Chinese problem wasn't to be the last one, and there was lots of political action. The first political convention in Alaska was held there. The meeting provided for an election to be held that year to send a delegate to Congress. Miners' law was replaced by federal law when Henry States was made U.S. Commissioner. Before that, well, law in Juneau was a bit lax. Dan Kennedy, one of the first watchmen, acted as a kind of marshal. Dan would often turn his prisoners out in the morning with instructions for them to be back in the evening. As soon as Congress passed a bill for the incorporation of Alaskan cities, a petition was presented to the judge of the district, and Juneau was incorporated June 29, 1900. Congress made Juneau the capital because of the convenient location and the amount of business being conducted there. The courthouse was erected in 1903. But the governor did not come from Sitka until 1906. 7 years later, January 1, 1913, Governor and Mrs. Walter Clark combined the annual New Year's Day reception with the formal opening of the new governor's house. It had been authorized in 1910 and built at a cost of $40,000. The first territorial legislature met in what is now the Elks Building in 1913. A survey of that period shows that there were 2,500 people, 2 banks, assorted businesses included a brewery, 2 dairies, 11 saloons, 12 grocery stores and fruit shops, 2 bookstores, and 1 cold storage plant. The town boasted 2 newspapers, the Alaska Daily Record and the Alaska Daily Dispatch. On the professional level, there were 4 surgeons and 19 resident lawyers. There were 5 churches, 9 hotels and lodging houses, and of course, many mines. Mention is not made of the infamous South Franklin Street Red Light District, which was in full operation. Some of those early Juneau names still exist today on buildings and memorials. Emory Valentine is one of those names.
Emory Valentine arrived in frontier Juneau in 1886 and set up a jewelry shop. Juneau was growing by this time, and Valentine, along with Goldstein and others, became one of the early city fathers. Fire was the big fear, and that fire department became known as Valentine's Volunteers, and they were good. Along with being fire chief, Valentine presided over a steadily growing city as mayor for 6 years. He helped develop the waterfront dock facilities, and helped encourage steamer traffic north, which sowed seeds for the Alaska steamship line. One big problem Valentine faced, along with others, were huge mudslides that would literally carry buildings and homes away. He supervised the massive cleanup which followed. He eventually built the Valentine Building, which in its day was a real beauty.
Another well-known pioneer was B.M. Behrens, who arrived in Nebraska and California from his native land of Germany before arriving in Juneau. He first served as Juneau manager of the Sitka Trading Company, but in 1904, he stepped out on his own and opened a mercantile store. This was followed in 1914 by the incorporation of his own bank, which was located next to the store. His early home is pointed out to many Juneau visitors. Judge James Wickersham lived in Juneau for a number of years. His home is now a museum where many of the judge's priceless records and memorabilia are displayed.
We enjoyed living in Douglas in its heyday and looking across the channel to the Juneau lights. Douglas sported its own baseball team, and Boomtown slowly took on all the look of a maturing city. New board sidewalks along the street connected many thriving businesses, not the least of which were several bars and saloons where the boys could gather to discuss the latest world events and try to look important to one another. Our first school was small. Students were a mixture of Indians and whites. Before long, a brand new building was required, and a very large frame structure was soon constructed. Stores carried the latest goods delivered on the many ships coming into the area. The Alaska Steamship Line later developed and had a modern dock and a ticket office here in Douglas. Douglas had its annual tin can cleanup, and I remember that everyone got into the act. The least excuse was a good one for a parade, and everyone turned out. The town had good spirit, still does. Funerals were elaborate affairs and brought forth huge crowds to pay final respects. Well, Douglas had some disastrous fires, too, which billowed smoke for miles. A fire in 1926 literally destroyed the huge Treadwell complex and severely damaged Douglas. Another fire in 1937 claimed many of the older buildings. Oh, gradually things quieted here, and much of the activity switched to the Juneau side, where the Alaska Juneau mine was going strong.
The Juneau-Douglas mining economy suffered a severe blow in 1917 when one arm of the Treadwell mine, which was out under the Gastineau Channel, caved in. Thanks to some warning the miners had, the only fatality was a mule. But all the workings were flooded except the Ready Bullion, which continued in operation for some time. The population of Treadwell decreased, and then, in 1926, a huge fire swept over Treadwell. By that time, a cross-channel bridge had been planned, and at the time of its construction, it was considered a marvel of engineering. Structures slowly crept out from both sides of the Gastineau to meet in the center. At last, Juneau and Douglas were connected by roadway. After moving to several leased buildings, the Alaska Territorial Legislature found a home of its own in 1931. It was called the Federal Territorial Building. The Ready Bullion and the Alaska Gastineau at Thane closed down shortly after World War I, leaving the Alaska Juneau as the only operative mine in the vicinity. The AJ, as it was called, continued in operation through the first part of World War II because certain metals mined as byproducts were considered strategic. But on April 8th, in 1944, a mining era came to a close in Juneau when the government ordered the Alaska Juneau mine shut down as a wartime manpower conservation effort. The impact, while severe, did not destroy Juneau. The big mines had not been operating at full capacity for years. The Army created a subport of embarkation, and the cities of Douglas and Juneau were having a small war boom. Government had become the town's largest industry. And in April of 1956, Alaskan voters ratified a constitution which reaffirmed Juneau as the capital. Since statehood was proclaimed in 1959, the business of government has steadily increased. While mining was still the prevalent industry, others were growing to take their place alongside. Fishing and lumbering were added as primary industries with the building of a sawmill and several canneries. There was even a pulp mill in the early 1920s. Salmon canneries and fish traps, until they were outlawed, were located at Tea Harbor, Chilkat, Chilkoot, Taku, Funter Bay, and Dundas Bay. Juneau, to its many visitors and residents, is more than a place. It's a state of mind. Sunrises and sunsets in that indefinable winter glow, the sound of a float plane taking off in the channel, piercing, icy Taku winds, steep streets, wooden stairways, and historic old buildings, people of all sizes and descriptions, and rain, old mining remnants, spectacular scenery and wildlife, deep snow and tire chains, hoochie-noo and hotcakes, the cry of 1,000 seagulls, small boats and ferry boats, a fascinating history, and most important of all, a faith in the future, no matter what it brings. All these and much, much more are a part of living in exciting and historic Juneau, Alaska.